Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to Judiciary Non-Civil Full Committee. I'm glad to see that some of the folks that were here earlier have the opportunity to come and testify. Again, I want to give my personal apologies for earlier, and I know you took your time out, and your time is valuable, so I appreciate you coming, and I'm glad that you have the opportunity to come in and talk to this. I've got one measure on the agenda today. It is Senate Bill 479. I'm going to ask the author to come up. Senator Hatchett, how are you today? Let me say a word of blessing over this real quick before we proceed. If you don't mind, those that would like to, please bow. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the blessings you've bestowed upon us, Lord. Just I ask that your will be here, and we do what is best for the state of Georgia. Give us the knowledge and the wisdom necessary to do that. We ask that in your Heavenly Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. Senator Hatchett, I appreciate you being here. You've had a marathon day in Judy Non-Civil, and I'm going to turn it over to you. And you got several people signed up to speak to this measure. And so I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, today I bring Senate Bill 479, LC number 393261S. This is a governor's bill, administration bill that addresses an issue in the state that was brought to light in a 2018 Supreme Court decision, Coates versus State. In that decision, the Supreme Court identified an issue with the way the statute was written around the word any, A-N-Y, and they interpreted it to mean that if you are a felon in possession of one firearm or an arsenal of firearms, you could only be charged with possession of one firearm instead of multiple. And so what this does, and in that decision, they actually stated that we do believe that it was the intent of the legislature to make harsher penalties for those who have possession of more firearms. However, the way the statute was written, they could not interpret it that way. So what this bill does is it corrects that statute and aligns the law with the original intent, which is to punish those that are in possession of more handguns or more firearms that are felons, as opposed to someone who just has possession of one.
Very good. Thank you for that concise review of the measure. I'm going to ask the committee if there are any questions for the author before we proceed to the folks that want to speak to the bill. I've got Representative McLaurin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I have to start by apologizing to the Senator because I'm much friendlier and more amenable to legislation in the club than I am here. I completely change personalities when I come into this room.
Understand.
So given that, I guess my question, and this is, anytime we talk about stacking new penalties offenses, I want to apply a rigorous test or standard to say, what are we going to get out of this in terms of public safety? Is it just for optics? Are we doing it because we want to say we're tough on crime, or are we getting something? So I guess my first question to you is, we hear a lot about, when it comes to guns and government regulation of guns, that more regulation of guns typically is not going to be helpful because the quote-unquote bad guy with a gun will find a way to get it anyway. Is that an argument you're familiar with?
I've heard that argument.
So if that argument is sort of the, conventional wisdom, I guess, of the right on guns. I mean, one thing I'm curious about with this bill is this is kind of 100% in that lane of more government regulation on, I'm assuming, this is not language I normally use, but the idea of the felon is bad guy, right? That felon in possession is somebody who's not supposed to have a gun. So why would adding more offenses for each of the firearms involved serve any purpose in terms of deterrence, or actually from a public safety perspective, keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them? Can you speak to why you have confidence that this measure would do that?
Senator, before you answer, just for the record, Representative McLaurin, do you support that idea that that you espoused just now?
We're going to do a question on a question.
I'm going to let him answer, but I just want to know, do you support the idea that why would we impose more gun laws because it doesn't deter criminals from owning guns?
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to dive deep with you on a philosophical discussion on the role of the minority in a legislative body, but what I'm attempting to do here is probe the majority's logic, because the majority is trying to, on the one hand, enact looser regulations on guns in the form of constitutional carry and opening up gun laws, the argument being that government regulation of guns doesn't do a whole lot, right? And that all you're doing is putting roadblocks in the way of good people who are trying to, exercise their Second Amendment rights. But at the same time, on the other hand, the majority, through the governor's office, is considering legislation that would increase government intervention in people's lives on the basis of possession of guns. And I understand that the difference that could be articulated is this sort of good guy, bad guy narrative, that there's good guys with guns, we want them to have guns, raining from the sky whenever we pull the shower cord, and it's just tons of guns. But with bad guys, that we want to do everything we can to, tie it off, no gun access. Not only is felon in possession the rule, but we're going to stack the offenses now so that multiple handguns create hundreds of years of exposure or whatever. And I guess my question is, if conditionally we subscribe to the idea that more government regulation of guns does not help with public safety, then what is the philosophical basis for this bill? Why do we think that this is going to deter people who shouldn't be possessing guns from having guns?
I think that's a great question. And, the philosophical debate we can get in for a long time, but I don't know the origin of the statute, but I'm assuming this may have been put into law when the Republicans were not in the majority, and the intent is to punish those that have more firearms as opposed to someone who just has one. If you're a felon and you have an arsenal, obviously there should be stricter punishments, and the intent was originally, and even the Supreme Court recognized that, is that if you should be charged with the appropriate crime, and if you have 10 firearms, you should be charged with possession of 10 firearms, I think that's the way the law had operated for years, and then following the Supreme Court decision, the way that these crimes were prosecuted changed, and I think I applaud the governor for being tough on crime and for bringing this statute up to date with the original intent.
I'll do one final sort of question/discussion point, which is, let me articulate a vision for you. And that vision is that if you have a criminal record, you've been convicted of a felony, and that information is public, it's in the, the database that law enforcement agencies use, and we have permit requirements where you apply for a permit at a Georgia gun store, and the check comes back and says, you can't buy this, you have a felony, right? And I know that there's federal regulations as well, but I'm articulating a vision for state law. So we have administrative requirements, sort of similar to our discussion about the other bill, right, with selling scrap metal. We have administrative requirements preventatively on the front end. And we screen people in a way so that the guns never get into the hands of people who shouldn't have them, right, for whatever reason. And then that is the way that we manage this problem primarily, is prevention, like with any good medicine, rather than relying on a costly, ineffective criminal justice system where there isn't really evidence that this type of measure will deter wrongdoers. On the back end, after these guns are already in the possession of the people who shouldn't have them. These are two competing visions for how to deal with this policy problem. And I guess my question to you is, why do you prefer, if you prefer, the one where we wait for the guns to be in the hands of people who shouldn't have them and then impose this type of, punishment after the fact? Why would you prefer that world over a world where we have more administrative screens on the front end to prevent the thousands of people who were denied permits, in a recent year under our current permitting scheme? Why would you want to take that away and rely on the reactive system instead?
Well, with all due respect, I would prefer felons not have guns to begin with. And that's obviously what the statute says. But, this bill has a companion bill, which was passed out of the House, which relates to possession of child pornography, possession and child molestations, and the way that the Supreme Court construed the statute in the word any would prevent a child molester from being charged multiple times for molesting the same child. It would also prevent someone who is in possession of child pornography from being charged multiple times for the number of images they have. And so, this is a policy that is, once again, I applaud the governor, and I think it's needed, and this is the way that the system operated until that Supreme Court decision, and I don't want us to go backwards, and this is a way to close the loophole and, I guess, align with the original intent of this statute.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I could, just the final comment, this is the last thing I want to say. To my mind, the only connection between this legislation and the legislation you're talking about regarding child pornography and assault is the statutory construction of the word any. Otherwise, those issues are not linked, right? It's the mechanism by which a court found that different criminal laws need to be updated. I am alarmed, and I genuinely mean this, by the trend of the conservative base in modern times to connect unrelated policy issues, in this case guns, to the ideas of child pornography, pedophilia, for those to be talking points that get brought in and linked in order to increase the perceived severity of the bill or need for a bill. And I think you see the alarming effects of that with the way that the Senate is being pressured not to pass the Speaker's signature bipartisan comprehensive mental health reform, because the idea of pedophilia is being linked to that bill in a very unfortunate way. And my concern is that if we have conversations like this, where we casually link different issue areas to child pornography, pedophilia, whatever, and use that as a cudgel, that we are encouraging the Republican base to continue to enact and, basically buy into wild conspiracy theories that have nothing to do with substantive policymaking that distract us from the actual issues at hand. So I understand that wasn't your intention there, but I want to highlight that, it seems like we are drifting further and further away from substantive public policy discussions on the issues, good medicine, preventative medicine, and we're moving into a space that's just about messaging, and if necessary, break glass in case of a problem and pull, even more inflammatory topics like child pornography in order to justify our policies. So there's a lot going on in the Capitol, and that informs why I want to make that comment today. But I'm very worried about the way that we're approaching some of these issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative McLaurin. Got two more flashers here. Let's see, Vice Chairman Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, Senator, I've read over the case and appreciate the governor's office sending that to me. You remember how many firearms there were in that case specifically?
I don't.
Okay, there were 4. Just trying to get to the intent here. Is there a concern and a need to address the issue of trafficking guns in our state?
Absolutely.
And have you seen any data on how much that's been going on here as of late?
I have seen data, but I can't quote the data off the top of my head.
Sure.
Yeah.
I understand. I get that. I can say this, and Representative McLaurin, I'll just tell you, I have personally had to deal with a convicted felon being in possession of a firearm, and the issue of self-defense of himself and others. And after extensive research on the case law, there are very few fact patterns where a convicted felon could defend themselves and others. And even though that may have been a sad result, there's an issue with that. And I appreciate your passion for the issue. There's a discussion that needs to be had on some of this, but ultimately in our system, we have human actors in it, and we have prosecutorial discretion. And I don't know how we eliminate the human error element on both sides, but for this, I can foresee situations where this would need to be addressed. To be quite frank, I did have reservations about this at the inception, but trying to learn the intent here, gun trafficking is a very real thing. And so I appreciate the author bringing this bill, and like I said with my colleague, Representative McLaurin, there are some results that happen under our law that are not always what we think they should be, but hopefully we can address those sort of issues in the future. I'd look forward to that, but thank you again, Senator, for bringing this, and Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate time.
Thank you. I got flashing light here. Representative Saines.
Thank you, Leader Hatchett, for bringing this together. I actually wrote down the child pornography bill before you stated it, so I'm at loss. I'm not disagreeing with my colleague, but I guess I am, because it does parallel to me. We talked in that piece of legislation, in terms of the concept, we talked about separate actions, and every individual time that a perpetrator chose to take a picture of a child, that was one separate action of deciding to violate Georgia law and violate that individual's. I don't even have a word for it, so this is talking about every separate action of violating Georgia law by having a separate weapon. And I think as we worked, I think that the Senate and both the House have looked at legislation to make it easier for law-abiding citizens to practice their Second Amendment constitutionally protected rights. You're also looking at ensuring those that aren't law-abiding citizens, those who wouldn't pass a background check, but we've recognized that there's a legal means to already possess firearms, we're ensuring that our penalties are as severe as they should be for those individuals. Is that not a fair characterization of this bill?
Yeah, and thank you, Representative. It is, and this bill gained bipartisan support, and it's the policy. And I apologize to the representative earlier. I was responding to the policy question, and this is policy. It's not politics, but it's so easy to bring in emotion to rile up a crowd, and that was not my intent. It was simply, I think it was a ripe response, considering both of these bills address the same construction of a statute, and our Supreme Court has definitely shifted to be more textualist in nature as they construe statutes. And as Representative Smith said, humans aren't perfect. Well, the legislature's not perfect too in the way we write their statutes, but it's clear what the intent was, and this is aligning our statute with the intent. When you are a felon and you possess multiple firearms, you should be charged with the number of firearms you possess.
Thank you for carrying this bill.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Representative Saines. I'm going to hold you off just until we move through these. Now I'm reading the. No, I've got Kendrick. Excuse me. Hold on one second, Representative Kendrick. I'm reading the words from the Coates case, and I can certainly see where there could be some ambiguity in there, and I agree with you that I think in practice and the intent was to allow for each individual firearm to be charged, and so that's the status quo. That's the way we have been operating, and we've made a policy decision as a state to say that felons shall not have guns. We've made that decision already. That is the law. And so we're clearly just amending the code, as I see it, to get to the real intent of what was initially passed. And we do that many times throughout the year. Well, since I've been here, it's something we've done often in response to court cases. So I also appreciate you bringing this bill. I'm gonna run through if you don't mind, Senator, I'm gonna run through the speakers and then give you the last word. I'm gonna go in the order of those for the bill, and then I'll let the folks that are against the bill finish, and then we'll let the final word go to the author. First, I'm going to call Pete Skandalakis from PAC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Pete Skandalakis. I'm the Executive Director for the Prosecuting Attorneys Council. And there's really not a lot I can say other than what Leader Hatchett's already said. This is to address the Coates decision. This is a matter which the District Attorneys Association took up a couple of years ago, and we were unsuccessful at that time, but now we've brought it back. And the governor has blessed us, I guess, in a certain sense, to sponsor this legislation, have Leader Hatchett sponsor it. And it simply is that those people who've been convicted of felonies can't possess can't possess a firearm, but cannot have multiple firearms. And I can tell you my experience as a prosecutor for close to 38 years has been we sometimes run into a situation where convicted felons are either holding firearms for others, or there's a stash house where firearms are kept, or where a car is stopped and pursuant to a legal search, multiple weapons are found, and this is meant to address that issue. It's that simple, and the District Attorneys Association favors this bill as well as the Prosecuting Attorneys Council.
Thank you, Mr. Skandalakis. I have a question. Is there a process in current law that allows for a felon to petition the court to get their gun rights back?
There is a process in which you can seek a pardon. I'm not aware of any process that allows a convicted felon to possess a firearm.
Okay.
There may be, I'm just not aware of it.
All right. I've had several people come to me and ask me about that since this legislation was there, and I have never done that type of work.
I will do
appreciate
some
that.
research and get back to you on it.
Representative Smith's going to enlighten us.
So I don't know if you want to phone a friend, but I do have an answer on that. So there is a very, very limited circumstance in which a convicted felon could at least use a firearm.
There is that.
In their defense, but as far as getting them back, I believe that would be having to get a pardon from the government.
And even if you get a pardon, sometimes there's a restriction on whether or not you can possess a firearm. Right. Because I do know people who have made mistakes, have been convicted, they've received a pardon, and they want to own a hunting rifle, and we've tried to help them with that situation. However, what you're talking about is when a convicted felon uses a firearm in self-defense, he has an affirmative defense. He or she has an affirmative defense, and as a prosecutor, I took that into consideration. That yes, you're not supposed to own a firearm, but during this dispute, whatever happened, somehow you get access to it, you use it in self-defense, and you are allowed to use a firearm in self-defense.
Well, thank you for that. I wish we had 100 more of you.
Representative McLaurin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Hello, Mr. Skandalakis. Glad to have you here. If we could just get some clarity on the sort of before and after, what can you do with the bill, without the bill, just on a couple points. The first is in terms of forfeiture. If you find somebody convicted of a felony that's in possession of some stash of guns, regardless of the charging consequences of that, those guns can all be confiscated, correct?
That's correct. It'd be contraband, be evidence of a crime, correct.
Sure. Okay. So from a public safety standpoint, we already have the ability to at least take those guns out, and through normal investigative means, this bill wouldn't change our ability to remove guns we find.
No, sir.
Okay. So I guess the only thing that this bill really does is create more exposure for somebody with multiple guns on a subsequent charge and sentencing. From a practical standpoint, and I know it's impossible to get you to just spit out actual averages in terms of numbers, but I mean, right now, if somebody has 1, 2, 5 guns, the second, felon in possession exposure on that is 1 to 10. Is that right? So already, if you've got a stash house, a judge could say, I find this is super dangerous. You definitely don't understand what's going on here. Here's a 10-year sentence.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so practically speaking, what we're talking about is that difference between 10 and some other number, which, I mean, let's say somebody had 10 guns, which it sounds like a realistic scenario if they're
It is.
holding in front of people. That's 100 years potential exposure, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you articulate to me what the public policy difference is in terms of the need for that tool, the sentencing exposure, between 10 and 50 or 100 or whatever, and why that would change substantively public safety outcomes after this bill?
Well, I am not so naive as to believe it would change public safety. I am of the belief it holds people accountable. And that's the whole purpose, to hold people accountable and hopefully send a message to other convicted felons that you can't be engaged in this type of conduct. I've been a prosecutor a long time, and I know that we try to say, if we pass this statute, we become a safer state. Y'all know as well as I do that we have been unsuccessful in stopping crime, and I think we'll always be unsuccessful. But what the point is it does hold people accountable. And it says if you're going to run guns, you have a larger exposure to the criminal legal system for a longer penalty, which the Board of Pardons and Paroles can consider, can decide to parole. You can obviously change your life around. I've seen many people change their lives around in prison. But it's an accountability process, and that's the way I would answer that.
Last question is, do you believe that regulation of quote-unquote bad guys with guns is fruitless or hopeless, or is there some ray of light, some hope that if the government tries to regulate the possession of guns, it'll be successful?
That is a bigger discussion that you and I can sit down and have, because when you talk about bad guys, you best go back and look about, did they graduate from high school? Because we know that people that don't graduate from high school tend to come into the criminal legal system more often than those who do graduate from high school. Then you can go back and look at their family background. Do they come from a family support group? I was fortunate. My father was an immigrant. My mother was Greek, but she was born in New York City, sent back to Greece after the Great Depression. But when all the Greeks came over in the 1950s, I wasn't punished only by my mom and dad. My aunts and uncles had rights to punish me too. So, we're talking about a lot of different things when we talk about crime and things of that nature. This is holding people accountable.
I very much appreciate that answer, and I'll stop my annoyingness on this point here and just say I think that it's healthy for us in considering legislation like this to acknowledge complex social factors, which you started to get into, that underlie crime or what we define as crime. And I think it's a worthwhile moment for this committee and for the membership of the General Assembly at large to reflect that this is the governor's priority, to impose further restrictions on the possession of guns. That with this bill, the majority is rejecting the idea that bad guys are just going to get guns anyway.
Representative McLaurin, the governor, has a number of priorities, and I think that's unfair to put that just on the governor and say this is his only priority, because
No, that's not what I'm saying.
That's how it came across to me. And as a state representative, I'm always amazed how much work y'all do in how many different fields. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for you and for everybody here, because you have to touch something in every field. But I don't think this is the governor's only priority.
Well, if I said only, that I misspoke with epic proportions, but it is a priority, clearly, because the floor leader is here with the bill. So my point being, I think that it's an important moment for reflection, that we are not using a completely black and white narrative about bad guys are just going to get guns anyway, whatever it might be.
I think this is a tool that law enforcement needs to hold people accountable, who have shown a lack of respect for society and for public safety. That's the way I would answer that.
Thank you joining me on this journey. Thank you, Mr. Scandalak.
Thank you, Mr. Scandalak. I got another question for you. I do want to add, though, that we're talking about felons here. So a lot of times when in conversations we have here, ignorance is not an excuse for breaking laws, right?
Yes, sir.
These folks have been before a judge. They have been adjudicated. They have been told.
They have been told.
Directly, you are not to have a pistol, shotgun, rifle. You have been told. There is no miscommunication here. There is no excuse to say, well, I didn't know, right?
Yes,
some of the longer that we have a dialogue about the underlying causes of these crimes, it comes to me that there are times that if we continue to increase the punitive nature of the crime, where people, they're not considering, is it 5 to 10 or is it 10 to 20? I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that when some people are committing a crime, they may not understand the degree to which they're going to be punished. But these folks that are felons, that have stood before a judge, have had direct communication to say, you cannot have a gun, you can't have it in your possession, you can't have it in your home, you can't have it in your utility shed out back, you cannot have it in your car or your trunk or anything anywhere. So this is not one of those cases. And I see this for what it is, and this is just clarity to the law in response to a court case. Representative Saines.
Thank you. My question is threefold. It kept adding up. What would you say if our state wanted to send a message to citizens of the state of Georgia that we are trying to deter behavior? What is our main way to do so?
You pass statutes with penalties.
And is it not fair to say this bill ensures that statute is more strongly held and with more severe consequences?
Absolutely.
And if an officer were to stop an individual that's on probation that has multiple firearms, is it not fair to say that each separate firearm poses a unique risk to that officer in that stop?
Absolutely, I would agree.
Thank you. So I'll close with this. I'm at a loss. I'm glad my colleague acknowledged this is about public safety. This is about us addressing gun rights, because I think it is. I think it's if you can give me a bill that doesn't infringe on the constitutionally protected rights of my law-abiding citizens and ensures that they are living in a more safe community, which this does both, I don't have any issue with it. And I think that our governor has been extremely consistent in that, and this only furthers that consistency. So I appreciate you bringing it. Again, I think this is a great bill, and thank you for the answers.
And I'll add one more thing, and that is a lot of these break-ins now that we're looking into cars, one of the things that we're warning people is don't keep your firearm in your car, simply because firearms are a currency on the street. And they are a currency for convicted felons. We have seen that. And I think it's a good bill. I mean, that's my opinion, the opinion of the DA's Association.
Thank you, Mr. Skandalakis.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Assistant Director Melvin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Melvin. I'm the Assistant Director of the Georgia Bureau of Investigations. Prior to that, I was a prosecutor for 25 years. I just would like to stand in support of the motion. I'd also like to bring out to the court, and this is in the Coates decision, what Justice Namias, our Chief Judge of the Supreme Court, said in the 2010 case of Stovall versus the state. It makes sense to punish a defendant who possesses 2 guns more harshly than a defendant who possesses only 1 gun. So even our Supreme Court understands that this is a matter of common sense. The only other thing I have to add to what's gone before is the philosophical deterrence argument. Over my 25 years, I've listened to hundreds of hours of jail phone calls, of wiretap communications. And I can tell you, in those counties where the law is more vigorously applied, criminals avoid. When I was in Cobb County District Attorney's Office, I heard multiple times defendants would not engage in crime and come up from Fulton County. We ain't going to Cobb. They actually go to jail for trafficking in Cobb. They would stay in Fulton County. So along the philosophical lines that we're talking about, where the law is appropriately and vigorously enforced, then there is a deterrent effect. One of the areas that we're seeing, and I'll conclude with this, where guns are becoming an increasing problem is in the gang violence across the state. Just like Director Skandalakis alluded to, we have more and more stash houses that we're finding with more and more guns. And we're just asking simply for the tools to be able to bring the charges that are appropriate for the situation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Representative Saines.
Thank you for being here, and I appreciate GBI's leadership when it comes to gang violence in our state. And I believe Director Scandilanak, sorry, my coffee's making my mouth dry, brought it up, the currency that it is, and you with the recording messages that you have witnessed. So when an individual is looking at possibly the streets of Atlanta or Brunswick and looking at firearms available on the street, if they haven't listened and heed caution to keep it in their car, would this bill would not keep it in their mind that each additional theft of a firearm from a law-abiding citizen is an additional penalty that they could possibly face if they're on probation?
All right, that makes sense to me, sir.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Saines, and thank you, Assistant Director, and I hope you get well soon, my friend. You're looking like,
A little rough.
yeah, you had had a ride.
Was that the Senate that did that?
All right, so that concludes everybody from the fours. I'm going to roll through the againsts. I apologize. I think a doctor wrote this one. It's Michael McClare. Michael McClare from the Councilman Antonio Lewis.
I'm actually here to speak for 171, so it's not.
You're speaking for?
Against 171.
Oh, we're not here in 171. For anybody that is here for 171, we are not hearing 171. Okay, so I'm sorry. I should have made that clear to you earlier. I apologize. There's no sneaky business here. I can give you that, my word. I'm not going to do that to you. I believe that this forum is for a full-throated debate, no matter what measure we have. And I'm not going to. And I hope my colleague will attest to that. I don't play the sneaky business. So hold on a minute, Representative Saines. So. All right, so we got all these folks that I thought we had that were against our 171. So just to make sure you do not want to speak to this bill. All right, what is your name?
Kiana Jones.
Tiana.
Toward the end, Keyanna. Last name Jones.
Miss Kiana, you didn't sign up. We can't hear from you. I'm just kidding. Come on. No, come on. Miss
Right.
And
I know how to reach you.
All right, very good. Miss Kiana, tell me, give us your name and then tell us who you're with and tell us what you'd like to tell us about this bill.
My name is Kiana Jones. I am a community organizer and an activist. I am the co-founder of the Reformative Action National Task Force and the Assistant Director of Justice for Georgia. Now, what I want to say about this bill is what Representative McLaurin could not say, is that it appears the intent behind the bill is to further be able to criminalize and punish black people because, and not only black people, brown people, who make up probably the majority of people who've been charged with felonies. Now, if you can get one more way to charge more black people with felonies, look, Mr. Skandalakis said it. You have to look at the underlying theme and what causes crime. So when you look at it again, let's go back to the family structure. Let's go back to communities that are marginalized, communities that have been left for dead, for lack of a better term, because they don't get resources, because they don't get the same opportunities as other more affluent communities. Those communities are largely minority. So when you look at the whole schematic and you want to go all the way back to day one, let's keep the income gap as big as it is. Let's keep punishing black and brown boys and girls
Ms. Jones,
more than you do in school.
I do want to give you the opportunity to speak to this bill, but I would ask you to stay within the guidelines of the bill
Now, if
itself.
Mr. Skandalakis was able to talk to the underlying themes that encourage and
He
influence
was
crime,
asked about the underlying themes.
you know what, you're right, you didn't ask me, and you probably won't, because it appears
We're just asking.
that sometimes
are you for or against this bill?
I am absolutely against this bill.
Does this bill say
because
that it
Go ahead.
only pertains to black or brown felons?
You don't have to say it.
It
It's
does
in
not
the
say
language,
that.
and it's an underlying theme. We know that. Please don't take this public or people who are against this bill for ignorant. We know coded language. We know veiled themes when we see it. We've already seen legislation come from this body to be introduced that would only serve to harm minority communities. All we want y'all to do is be honest about it. You don't have to put it in coded language because we already see what it is. All I'm saying is that we know the governor's agenda. Well, let me not say we know it, because the governor also said that he would not sign any more elections legislation, but he went back on that. So I don't know how much we can trust the governor or his agenda at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. We got a question online. Representative Kendrick.
Can you hear me? Well, the question was for the previous speaker, but I know we have discussions about the appropriateness of underlying language and tones of the bill. So I just wanted to thank the last speaker for bringing up what we know is always the underlying concern about these criminal justice reform bills, and is how it's going to affect communities of color that I represent, that we all represent. And I think that that is a valid point. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Kendrick. I just want to go ahead while the author is back coming up to the podium. I want to read through this bill right here, and just to be clear that there is no underlying or hidden agenda here. What it says is any person, not doesn't call a person by an ethnicity or a religion or anything of that nature. It says any person who is on probation as a felon. It doesn't characterize the felon in any manner further than that. The words on this paper, frankly, do not say what was implied they say. And so I want to make sure to point that out. This is a measure in response to a Supreme Court case. And I hate that we, along the lines of Representative McLaurin's testimony earlier, we are driving either far to the right or far to the left. I don't represent just Republicans. I don't represent just Democrats. I represent everybody in my district. And it's trying to continue to, it's just tough to continue to hear that. I mean, I appreciate every person's perspective on these measures, but please don't impute to me or this body here, sitting here, anything other than what we say or we do objectively. Because to read into something that's not there, that's an attack on me, on my committee, and on what we're doing here. We're up here away from our families to pass good legislation. I've got children at home, much like many of you, and I want my kids to live in a Georgia that it's free and fair for everybody, regardless of your color or your creed. I want it to be fair and equitable. And I commit to you that when I have a bill before my committee, the last thing on my mind is trying to unbalance the scales of inequity. That's not what I'm here to do. And while I appreciate your perspective, that's just not me, and I don't believe that's many of my colleagues up here. So, Senator Hatchett, go ahead. I'm going to give you the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I appreciate the discussion today. As I stated earlier, this bill is in response to a Supreme Court decision. Justice Namias said a person that has 2 guns should be punished harsher than someone that has 1. Felons are not allowed to possess guns in the state of Georgia. This was the original intent of the legislation that goes back I don't know when it was enacted, but I'm assuming it was prior to when Republicans even took over the majority. We've already discussed other pieces of legislation that are going through the Capitol now that also address this policy as it relates to other offenses. And I ask, this is a public safety measure. This is a good bill, and I ask for your favorable consideration. Thank you.
Thank you again for bringing this measure. Now is the appropriate time for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, move to pass.
I have a motion to pass. Do we have a second? We have a second. We have a move to pass and a second for Senate Bill 479, LC 393261S. Are there any amendments to be discussed? Representative McLaurin.
Just, I guess this is literally a parliamentary inquiry. Are you going to entertain discussion on the motion, or are we just doing amendments and then questions?
I will entertain discussion.
Okay,
on the
I'll
motion.
withdraw whatever amendment I was about to do.
Hearing no amendments, we have before the committee a move to pass and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Representative McLaurin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I don't often go this far into trying to open my heart up, but I want to do it briefly because I think there's some pain in the room, and it's on multiple sides of an issue. And to the author, I hope to work with you next year in my crazy attempt to join your crazy chamber, and hopefully we'll do excellent things together. But, there's a real feeling of pain this session, about a lot of issues. It's not just guns or, mental health or whatever. I think we're feeling the tension of a state that's in transition politically in a lot of different ways. To speak to both of the folks who've spoken on the issue of race today, the person at the top of the room and the witness who testified earlier, I think the role of this committee is to navigate the difference between that perspective and this perspective, and the important thing is that we do it. We won't solve it today. But it's hard if you're a black person who lives in Atlanta, who has constant interactions with APD and very little socioeconomic opportunity. If you get picked up on a felony and you go to one of our prisons, which everybody knows I'm talking about how they're in disarray, and the day you get there, you're sorted into a cell based on your race because of a gang rationale, because for public safety reasons, gangs in prisons affiliate according to race, and so there's de facto racial discrimination when you're put in a cell with somebody of the same race for safety reasons. It's hard to tell that person who has never had the opportunity really to live a different life and is put in these circumstances that this is not about race. It's very, very hard to tell that person that. And I trust and am friends with the chairman of this committee. I think James Burchett is a deeply good guy. I think when he says, I don't intend to do X, Y, Z, he means that. But I think the important thing for people like us who sit here with these pins and badges on at the helm of a system that is prestigious to move chairs around on. It's prestigious to be here. Mr. Chairman this, Mr. Chairman that, to change the laws. Mr. Scanalakis agreed with Representative Saines. How do we signal something to a community? We change a statute. We message to the community. But do we talk enough about what the policy already is and what the change will accomplish? And today, we are saying as a committee that 10 years is not enough exposure in one of our state prisons to address the problem of multiple guns in the possession of somebody who is convicted of a felony. This isn't just some vague, untethered, hey, we care about public safety, so we're just doing a thing and don't worry about what the thing is. Some people will treat this that way. But what we're actually doing is making the policy judgment that 10 years is not enough. And so I think it's really constructive, although today kind of sucked, relative to the normal feeling in here. The reason is because the world kind of sucks and because there are things that need to make it from this end of the story to this end of the story. And even if we don't agree about all the details, it needs to be internalized that something this simple, 2 lines, lines 23 and lines 24, are about a much bigger picture than I appreciate the witnesses today who started to get into that story, that bigger picture. I'm going to be voting no on this today because I don't believe, as a policy matter, that more than 10 years exposure at the discretion of a sentencing judge is necessary to address this policy problem, in part because I don't know what that extra time does. When I get letters from people in prisons who say, I've done all the classes, I've got maxed out my PIC time of 12 months, I'm ready to go back and try again after years and years and years of being in these facilities. Sometimes they go through this sort of rehabilitation and reflection before 10 years, let alone the difference between 10 and 50, right? And so I just simply do not believe that we are getting our bang for our buck by moving around the chairs on this particular Titanic to increase exposure, and I wanted to give a fulsome explanation for why I'm voting no. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative McLaurin. Representative Saines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reflecting on what, and I appreciate, I hadn't had a chance to say this, but I appreciate the citizens who've come out here and frankly spent an entire day here trying to be heard on some policies to lack the ability to be heard. But I thank the individual who brought up the possible repercussions, the underlying circumstances. Made me look at what we're talking about here. We're talking about 190,000 individuals on felony probation based on 2018 numbers that the AGC reported last month. 3,500 violent crimes. Of 680 homicides, 670 sexual criminal acts, 285 robberies, and 1,870 other serious violent felonies have been linked to individuals on probation, all which carrying firearms would make the victims of those crimes in deeper harm. When we talk about the disproportionate impact of victims of these crimes, when I look at this, I look at it as an individual from a majority Caucasian community. I look at it as an individual with a Hispanic Costa Rican mother and a Cuban American father. This is unfair. The victims that are created here disproportionately affect the minority community. So I see no incongruency here to be supportive of this bill and supportive of the underlying circumstance, because you're right. This is not the area. This is not the committee. This is not the circumstance. As a peace officer, I've seen individuals that could probably have been helped and Head Start and prevented from taking a criminal act. But once they've chosen to do so, we need to prevent them from creating further victims. And I think that's what this bill does. And I thank you again for bringing it forward.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Representative Saines. With no more questions, we've got a motion and we've got a second, and I'm going to call the question. Senate Bill 479 LC 393261S. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All of those opposed signify a like sign.
No.
All right, is the opinion of the chair that the measure passes on the rules. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
With that there, we are going to adjourn. I appreciate everybody's attendance today.